Welcome to this evening's RTV broadcast. We're considering the role of the United Nations tonight with Mark Seddon, particularly in terms of its response to the COVID crisis and the wider geopolitical influence that it has in the 21st century. Mark previously advised the former president of the UN General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, and was a former speechwriter for the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. He's a journalist and he's authored several books, including Jeremy Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Labour England, that was published in 2018. And he was the editor of Tribune from 1993 until 2004. So in the second half of tonight's broadcast, we're going to discuss the potential impacts of Jeremy Corbyn's new peace and justice project. But let me just start with the United Nations. And the UN produced a comprehensive response to COVID-19 entitled Saving Lives, Protecting Societies and Recovering Better. And I was just looking at the executive summary, and the 3 points that it highlights is that they were talking about a large-scale, coordinated, comprehensive health response guided by the World Health Organization and a wide-ranging effort to address the devastating socioeconomic, humanitarian, human rights aspects of the crisis, with a focus on saving lives, keeping vital services accessible, households afloat, businesses solvent, and supply chains functioning. And thirdly, a recovery process that builds back better. And I just wondered, Mark, how you think this government's doing against that criterion that the UN set out.
Well, I think it's got to be a mixed bag. By the way, I think the UN has had to move away from using that line, build back better, because it was appropriated by Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. And of course, the UN isn't allowed to be seen to be supporting any political party at any given time. But no, I think the interesting thing is that, not only is the General Assembly essentially moved towards advocating universal healthcare. In other words, healthcare systems based on a UK type system of a national health service funded at source through taxation and what have you, but that it has tried to set out, its ideas for essentially having a global response to this crisis. And of course, the real problem it's faced from the outset this time round has been that in the time of Trump, in the time of Bolsonaro, in the time of Putin and Boris Johnson to a degree too, you've got individual member states following their own unilateral policies in many respects. So this kind of multilateral response has been much more difficult to bring together. And what's been very striking is that many of the East Asian countries, who of course have got a good experience of dealing with similar kinds of pandemics in the past, appear to have got a pretty rapid grip on the situation. And that also includes, Australasia. It includes other countries as well. Britain, as you know, Chris, has been way down the league in terms of its response, the efficiency of its response, particularly when it comes to what the WHO have been recommending right from the outset. The most basic thing, and I'm not a public health expert, but I did follow all of these things. Track, trace, and isolate. That was what the World Health Organization was advocating from the outset. Britain began by doing that, but as we know, for some reason, we're not entirely clear, but it moved towards this idea of having herd immunity. And of course, the pandemic then took hold. Now, in other respects, Britain has been late, but moved quickly. But after a late start, has improved its response. But at the end of the day, we have to look at mortality rates, and the reality is this country has got one of the highest mortality rates in the world. We were ill prepared. Without the National Health Service, we would have been in such deeper problems than we have been. We didn't have PPE, and we needed it. And of course, one of the other big stories, which will probably grow, I mean, there've been one or two people who are raising this in the press, but also, Labour MPs such as Dan Carden in Liverpool, he was onto this quite early on about the sort of the contracts, the whole issue of contracts. Admittedly, in the middle of a pandemic, you've got to move quickly. You've got to try and get all the PPE and all the rest of it. One of the big issues I think is going to emerge is a potential corruption on a major scale. That's a big issue. But the British response has been a mixed bag. The mortality rate has been very bad.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I just wonder, given your experience at the UN, and I only gave a very truncated CV when I was introducing you there, because I know you've had and continue to have involvement with the UN. What attention do you think the British ministers, the government in this country, actually pay to the advice coming out of the UN? I mean, do they just sort of go their own way, ignore it? I mean, and how does Britain compare with other nations around the world in terms of listening to the steer given by the United Nations?
Well, I mean, don't forget, the United States in the middle of the pandemic under Donald Trump actually withdrew funding to the World Health Organization. I mean, absolutely staggering. And then Trump called it the China virus. I mean, I do tend to make direct comparisons between the sort of extraordinary degree of deliberate irresponsibility by the Trump administration and compare it with what you might call, I suppose, Chris, British exceptionalism. This kind of, we're the best, so we know the best, we know what to do, which I think, partly drove the British response. One of the most senior WHO spokespeople in recent years has been David Nabarro. He is the representative of the WHO to Britain. He speaks for the WHO frequently. You hear him on the media here. I've watched him over the years. He had the responsibility of speaking for the WHO at the UN over the avian flu outbreak, over SARS. That's what made me, first as a journalist when I was there for Al Jazeera, and then subsequently when I worked for the Secretary General, I used to go and cover these press conferences. And so I was interested in, and learning more about the spread of viruses, especially when there wasn't a vaccine. And so, yes, I mean, look, I think it is probably it's probably true to say that we've got some brilliant scientists, some brilliant health professionals in this country. We've got a first-rate health service, despite all the cuts and everything that's thrown at it. I mean, the most extraordinary people, the most extraordinary dedication, wonderful frontline workers, and all of that. But British exceptionalism did mean that at the outset, I think there was a really serious question that had to be addressed at the Prime Minister. Why was he not picking up the phone immediately to the Chinese leadership, to the leadership in Korea, and to Taiwan, and to other countries in East Asia who've experienced in dealing and getting advice as to how best to handle what we knew by early January was heading our way? Why did these things not happen? Now, of course, it's easy for us. Here we are. We're sitting here. We're not having to run the NHS or deal with this or deal with that. It's very easy with the press, with hindsight, to say this and that. But I mean, there are some very basic questions at the outset that just weren't asked, and this should have happened. We should have been better prepared. And of course, if you recall, Boris Johnson himself was quite blasé. He was, those first press conferences, he was saying, "Well, I've been shaking people's hands. And I'm hugging people." And it was pretty. It was, nobody would wish this on anybody, but there was a kind of irony that the early stages of the pandemic, Boris Johnson and President Bolsonaro of Brazil were two political leaders who got it, and subsequently Trump got it. Almost those people are the most blasé or irresponsible in the case of Trump, the ones who get it. And by the way, Rudy Giuliani now has it.
Yeah. I mean, it was even more irresponsible, wasn't it, in terms of the way the government has failed to respond, because there was a sort of a dry run exercise in, I think it was 2016, looking at how prepared this country was, how prepared the National Health Service was in the event of a pandemic striking. And then, a few short years later, we were. So, there is no real excuse, because the conclusions that were drawn from that exercise demonstrated that we weren't prepared. There were problems with PPE and all the points that you've just made, Mark. So it's not that this kind of, as it were, took them by surprise, that they hadn't really kind of thought about it. I mean, they may not have thought about it, but they should have done, because there was this exercise that had taken place. I mean,
you're right, Chris, because avian flu gave a portend of what could happen. SARS gave a portend of what could happen. Of course, HIV is another virus that gave us a huge portend. We had Ebola, of course. I mean, Ebola, which is far more infectious apparently than COVID-19 and more deadly. There were actually some cases that actually came out of Central Africa, and there were cases in America and other countries. So yes, that the country should have been much better prepared. But I mean, you and I also know, and this is the media barely covers this now because it's ancient history in their sort of day-to-day world of who's up and who's down and whatever. But we had a decade or more of austerity, and arguably the worst chancellor in Britain's post-war history, George Osborne. George Osborne. He was the one whose policies of austerity we cut into the living quick of our welfare state and of the health service and much more. And so, what was needed in terms of stockpiles was not there because they hadn't spent any money on it.
No.
And I would be, it's Boris Johnson, to a degree, inherited the situation. The response was sporadic, not very good in comparison to other countries. But the real blame for this, to my mind, lies with those such as George Osborne, who used austerity to supposedly, aid a British economic recovery that simply did not happen on his watch.
Yeah, I mean, and just in terms of the UN's role again, though, if we could just return to that, I mean, we're a global village now, aren't we? I mean, the world has shrunk. International travel is so much easier now than it ever used to be. And is there a role, do you think? Should there be a role for the UN to be, a bit more interventionist, a bit more proactive? I mean, it seems, and again, from your experience, Mark, that it's almost, I mean, they can give the lead, but it's almost as if, the government's, may sort of take the advice or not. And clearly, our government seems to go its own way. I mean, I just want, particularly given a response to something like a pandemic, I mean, you kind of need, do you not, an international response? And this kind of spasmodic approach that haphazard approach that we've had, from our government and indeed the, Donald Trump's administration. I mean, not only is that bad news for the people in those countries, but because of the kind of travel arrangements and all the rest of it, and how people are still mixing, even in the height of a pandemic. I mean,
well, in all of this, Chris, I mean, what clearly comes across time and time again, and we kind of know this to be obvious and axiomatic, that if you work together rather than work alone, you're going to achieve more. And so, we have managed. When I say we, we've managed to get to a situation whereby there are vaccines now available that would normally take up to 10 years. This is what we're told. It's taken less than a year. And this is because there's been global cooperation. And that global cooperation has extended elsewhere too. The response, the advice of the World Health Organization has been followed in many other member states across the world. And of course, the UN and the WHO are very concerned now that supplies of vaccine reach all countries. It shouldn't just be those countries who have got the economic clout that get the vaccines. I mean, for what it's worth, I was talking to the High Commissioner of the Maldives last week, and of course they were doing their best to get their hands on some vaccine for their population, small developing country, and that's the case all over the world. So there's got to be much more global cooperation. I think that much has been learned. You were talking about this kind of global village in which we live. I mean, the fact that something can spread from a wet market in China and circulate the globe literally within months or weeks, and that there has to be a global response to defeat it, would suggest that we really do need a UN that is stronger and more fit for purpose. The UN's problem this year, of course, in many respects, and the problem of diplomats, they haven't been able to meet. I mean, the UN is empty. It's all as we're doing now. It's on Zoom or on these video conferences. So, the General Assembly that takes place, every autumn, happened for the most part offline. So all that sort of diplomatic work behind the scenes hasn't been taking place. There's a real push amongst diplomats from different countries now to get back to the UN because they're worried that essentially the organization has lost some of its clout because it's become more invisible in these times. Yeah, I mean, the UN.
Do you think, Mark, that one of the positive consequences then of the COVID crisis is that it might encourage governments, I mean, even in places like Britain, to collaborate a bit more? And do you think it also spells, or maybe if not spells the death knell, but certainly points to the failings of the kind of neoliberal economic agenda that we've been living with for the last
40 years? I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you see, in the United States, because I mean, I lived there off and on since 2005, and when you go there, you realise that in terms of basic healthcare, you're essentially a paycheck away from being on Skid Row and not having any health insurance. If you lose your job, you lose your health insurance.
Yeah.
And then you're thrown on the mercy of a very, very basic Medicaid. And if you're over 65, you get Medicaid. You get but it's an appalling system. We know that over 40 million people have no medical insurance whatsoever. And in fact, Bernie Sanders's campaign around Medicare, medical insurance, and national insurance, he kept on talking about the Scandinavian and the experience of health and the British NHS and what have you, and they still don't have anything like that in the States. And then you also look now at the utter failure, absolute deliberate decision by President Trump, really to wash his hands of Trump and to politicize it as well. Only in the United States at the moment could wearing a face mask, be seen to identify you as a Republican or a Democrat. It's been utterly appalling. Now, part of the issue too are the state governors. You're more likely to have a better public health policy in New York State than South Dakota. South Dakota currently now has the world's the highest number of COVID cases in the world, I think. But it is quite extraordinary. So that model, we can in many ways we can see how it fails. But it's the key thing is how Americans perceive it, because you will have seen as well, Chris. Lots of ordinary working class Americans actually demonstrating against Medicare. When Trump was first elected, to us this seems completely bonkers. I mean, so I think more Americans can see, because so many people are being impacted by this, with so many deaths. I mean, it's over 200,000 now, I believe, and growing is 3,000 people a day. That's the number of people that were killed in the attacks on the World Trade Center. Yes. Americans can see this. So this model is expiring before us. And when I was working for the President of the General Assembly, the General Assembly did adopt universal healthcare as for all member states as something that and essentially provided the different types of mechanisms for how it could be adopted by member states. And of course, social insurance can take many different forms. There are different ways of organizing it. And the Taiwan system, for instance, I've been to Taiwan. I saw how it worked. It's very, very good. It's different to the British system. I'm not enough of an expert to explain, how it is different, but, different systems, but they're still based on this idea of social insurance. And this is key.
The key thing is that people get free healthcare at the point of need, and however it's organised, I think that should be the guiding principle. And obviously, I think the failings of this government, but I mean, it's not just here. I mean, there have been other governments around the world, just in terms of responding to COVID. Hopefully, will lead us or lead them to adopt a more collaborative approach in the future. But I just wanted to move on, if I can, Mark, in terms of the role of the UN in other geopolitical issues. I mean, the original founding charter talked about we the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save and succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. And since that charter, since that statement was published just after the Second World War, we've been almost in a constant state of war in one part of the globe or another. I mean, is that, has the UN failed? Can it work? Is it? I mean, what influence is it having? Do you think has its influence waned or increased, or does it ebb and flow in your experience?
I think it's been very important in many respects. During the period of the Cold War, for instance, and the emergence of the non-aligned movement, as the global South gained its freedom from colonialism, and became essentially a bargaining chip at the United Nations, and was able to essentially push its agenda and play one side off against another. And it was as brutal as that in many respects. That, at a very raw level, was an important factor. But more considerably, the way the role the UN has played over non-proliferation, over nuclear non-proliferation, over arms control, has all been very, very consequential over a long period of time. There has not been a third world war to end all wars. We've come close to it. The missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, would be one. There have been a number of times when it's been pretty close, but without the United Nations, without having that building there in New York, and without being able to bring people together, diplomats, and it's arguable that things could have been worse. Many of the conflicts that you're referring to, Chris, have been wars of proxy wars. Certainly during the Cold War. I mean, you think of the civil war in Angola. You think more recently the proxy war that's been carried out in Syria. I mean, there are very few of the so-called advanced nations who haven't got dirty hands in that. But I watched the UN, for instance, close up over Syria. And many people have been very critical. The UN was powerless to do this and powerless to do that. At the end of the day, the UN is only as powerful as member states would allow it to be. And of course, you had the big players there: Russia, the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, France, all these countries. The UN was constantly trying to end this horrendous conflict. It had some success over chemical weapons, for instance. And prohibiting and banning the use of chemical weapons in Syria eventually. I mean, there were problems, but that was a UN achievement. At various different times, it managed to oversee safe passages and zones where there were temporary ceasefires. It's not a glorious record, but in other parts of the world, the UN has been very, very significant. And I'm thinking about some of the peacekeeping operations around the world. East Timor, Timor-Leste, that was a success for the United Nations. The Mali has been another sort of success in UN terms. No, peacekeeping is really important. But in all of this, I mean, I'm hoping that with Trump out of the picture now, although, I mean, that's one, we could go back to that, because actually he didn't end up being a militarist. There weren't any wars under Trump. No. But although, he was tempted, but they weren't. I'd like to see that, that a new global leadership begins to use those mechanisms of the UN much more thoughtfully and powerfully.
Yes, no, indeed. And I mean, as a youngster, I just seem to, maybe it's me looking back through rose-tinted spectacles, but I seem to remember politicians of every stripe, really, but particularly Labour politicians, particularly people like Tony Benn, used to speak very, very, glowingly, really, about the important role that the UN plays. Maybe it's that generation that lived through and fought in the Second World War. Maybe that's what coloured their thinking. It doesn't seem to be on the agenda now. As far as I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just sort of living in a bubble or something. I find it difficult to find a time when you hear senior politicians of either the major political parties, promoting the important role that the UN has to play. Do you think that?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to find it this year actually, because come November. I mean, come November, Britain, Glasgow, is going to be host for the climate change conference, COP26, and there's going to be. Already, I mean, one of the few things you could say that this particular government has pushed the boat out on has been on on targets, on emission targets, and I think it's setting some really quite ambitious goals. Partly because Britain is hosting this very, very important UN climate change conference. This is the 5th anniversary of the Paris summit, and then the Paris Agreement and of course progress has been. But you see, there's another example where the UN is really, really very important. And we, although it's been slow and it hasn't, and we don't have much time really to turn around global heating. What progress there has been at the behest of the UN and member states who really realize how important it is. And you could say the same for the Sustainable Development Goals and what have you. So, yes, I think that you will see more of it. Tony Benn, of course, you're right. He was informed by his own experience in the Second World War, and the importance that also there were some totemic UN leaders like Dag Hammarskjöld, who was key for trying to get a peace. Peace in what was the Belgian Congo, and who was sadly, his plane was shot down. Yes. And he was killed as secretary. This had a great. There have been a series of amazing secretary generals. Kofi Annan, more recently, was a very popular. Well, I mean, when I was in New York, and I used to say I work for the UN, they say, "Well, how is Kofi Annan?" I used to say, "Well, he retired 8 years ago." Of course, Kofi Annan was rather late in the day in pronouncing on the legality of the Iraq War. Sadly, however, there have been. For all the criticisms that could be laid at the UN, I could point at 100 and other reasons and ways why it is working and why it is so important and why it deserves to be strengthened. The UN, Tony Benn used to also refer to it because he knew that the United Nations was actually written into the constitution of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is part of its constitution. I can't remember which clause. Maybe somebody can remember. Is a commitment to the United Nations.
I just wonder, do you think, Mark, that particularly politicians on the left and even wider social movements should be doing more to promote the role of the United Nations then?
Oh, I've got absolutely no doubt about that. Because the UN is such a great resource too. Yeah. I mean, for instance, I would say it's because in these particular times, we all know there's a great distrust of the media. And for very good reason, often. Historically, it's been owned by very rich people, very rich and powerful people. In countries like Britain and the United States, these very rich and powerful people most certainly don't want their taxes to be increased or for a different way of organizing society. So they are opposed to anything that is vaguely to the left. But more recently, I think that a lot of people have become concerned about the veracity of information. How truthful is the information that they're getting? And I would point them to the United Nations, because when I worked there and had to write speeches or had to prepare statements or whatever it was that I had to do, we had to go to the UN agencies for our statistics, for our facts and for our figures. And we had to be sure that our facts and our figures were correct. And the UN has actually set up a unit, which actually does a kind of fact check on everything. So in terms of unbiased information, the UN is the place to go to. The UN News Services Division. I mean, if people look up United Nations News Services, you can get very accurate information from around the world. And so, I was just watching before I came on the 6 o'clock news, because I thought we'd probably talk about this. And I thought, well, but I'll see how much of that half-hour news is devoted to anything that happens outside the United Kingdom. And tonight, there was zero. There wasn't even 1 minute of foreign news. And that, by the way, is increasingly the case on BBC News programs. They're much more parochial. So, the UN News Services, you can find out information from all around the world. That's very important. But more than just that, in terms of the campaigns, many of the things that people who are internationalists really believe in, the UN is there for all of this. For in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, in terms of peace, in terms of climate change, in terms of sustainable development, all of these things that are really important to all of us as humans, not just in one country, that's all there.
Well, I'm interested you say that, Mark, because, this movement that I'm involved in trying to organise, this kind of resistance movement, we very much want to be an internationalist movement and to stress the importance of collaboration and learning from, and recognizing how much we have in common with people around the world, with liberation struggles around the world. Far more in common, actually, with ordinary working people and people involved in struggle in developing nations than we have with the elites and the faceless corporations in this country.
Well, Chris, as you're saying that, I can see, you've got the Palestine flag behind you. Now, you know better than most that, the UN General Assembly, that's the global parliament of the people, has passed resolution after resolution,
absolutely,
calling for the end to the occupation of the Palestinian territories. This is the longest occupation in history. It continues. It's worse than an occupation now. It's a displacement, as we also know. So the UN, which is essentially the upholder of international law, whether it be international law governing the seas, maritime law, or whether it's international law guaranteeing the rights of Palestinians, is really, really important. And and another, I think, in terms of the work that you're doing, just simply pointing out to the fact that when President Trump decides unilaterally to move its embassy from Tel Aviv in Israel to Jerusalem, which is a city which is actually subject to as far as it's a UN administered zone, effectively. I mean, East and West Jerusalem, it is not one city, but it is kind of part of a UN zone. It's you cannot do this thing. It's breaking international law. So many times the Israeli governments have broken international law, and who points this out? The UN does, the Secretary General does, and so hopefully, there can be support from you and other organisations.
Absolutely. I mean, and thank you for that pointer towards UN News Services, and I think we do need to, as a movement, for our members and widely to disseminate that information to the wider public, because knowledge is power, and it's important, I think, that we do get that message out there. Incidentally, your point about displacement, of course, the whole basis of Israel was actually created on the basis of displacement, and nearly 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes, weren't they, to make way for the new Israeli state. But let me just move on to again, just to move up before we touch on and then get some comments from our viewers about Jeremy's Peace and Justice project. But I just wanted to get your thoughts about what prospect you think they are, whether you agree with what Tony Benn used to talk about. He wanted to see a radical United Nations. He said it should have powers over the International Monetary Fund, over the World Bank, over the World Trade Organization. He wanted powers invested in the United Nations to control the arms trade and to govern the conduct of multinationals and banks and a few other things as well. I mean, actually, to me, it's absolute. I mean, Tony Benn used to talk a hell of a lot of common sense, and I always talk about, common sense socialism. When Jeremy came to the fore, I was saying this is simply common sense socialism, the sort of socialism that the likes of Bill Shankly and my great hero Brian Clough used to talk about. What do you think of that? I mean, and is that something?
It's interesting because the World Bank is actually part of the apparatus of the United Nations. A lot of people don't know this, but the trouble is, over the years, it's drifted off, and of course, post Bretton Woods and all the rest of it, it's kind of been captured to many extent. It's kind of been captured by a sort of global establishment that kind of sees that solutions lie with markets and private enterprise. This is dominated thinking, as we know, since the late 70s. Also, I kind of think that the global South is missing a trick, and it's not united enough. I mean, the non-aligned movement, I used to go along to some of their meetings. I used to have to prepare some of the speeches of the President of the General Assembly to the non-aligned movement. I thought, well, you've got real potential clout. The bureaucracy of the United Nations is not going to turn the organization into a radical world government, which is, by the way, what a lot of the rednecks in the deep south of America fear the most. World government, world communist government. Yeah. But the global South could begin to move things in this sort of general direction and give much greater. What is needed too is a Secretary General who feels emboldened to speak out much more strongly. Now, the current one has kind of kept his head down because he didn't want the UN to be completely savaged by the Trump administration. As it is, the Trump administration, as you know, cut funding to the WHO, to UNESCO, to the United Nations Works and Relief Agency in Palestine. I mean, it's deeply damaging. But as far as Antonio Guterres is concerned, the Secretary General, it could have been a whole lot worse. Well, actually, perhaps, the UN itself, of course, there needs to be a lot of reform. There needs to be reform of the Security Council. A long time in coming. It's unrepresentative still because it represents the world at the end of the Second World War. The permanent members, Russia, America, China, Britain, France.
Yeah.
These are, Britain and France. What are Britain and France doing? Where and China, of course, but where is Africa represented? Where is South America represented?
Again, just going back to what Tony was saying, I mean, his view was there should be a type of like a card vote arrangement for the UN in terms of the weight of the votes. I don't know if you remember him talking, where he said that the voting strength, if you like, should be based on a per capita population. So China would have the biggest say, India next. In fact, I was saying that India and China together would have a majority on their own.
On that, which is an interesting one. I mean, I think there's certainly an argument for when it comes to, if you could democratize the Security Council, and to have voting on that basis, that would be very interesting. But of course, that you've also got the non-permanent members who are elected. But for the permanent 5, instead of them being permanent, that's another whole issue to be looked at. But don't forget, in the current General Assembly, it's 1 member, 1 vote. We talked about the Maldives. So the Maldives, for instance, has the same power in the General Assembly as the United States.
Do you think that's right then? I mean, what do you think Tony's like?
I mean, in the General Assembly, you don't often see the General Assembly because most of it, the best decisions are reached through consensus. But when there can't be consensus, let's say, and I'll give you just one example, which I saw when I was there. There have been rulings, as you know, from the International Court on Britain's continued occupation of the Chagos Islands, which it calls British Indian Ocean Territory, which were taken from Mauritius as a condition for independence. And as you know, the main island in the Chagos group, Diego Garcia, is home to the biggest, one of the biggest American military bases. Yeah. The people of the Chagos Islands were booted off. They were deported back to Mauritius. When I say they weren't deported back, they were sent to Mauritius. The General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to tell Britain that it should adopt international law and that the Chagos Islands should be returned to Mauritius. So that is when 1 member, 1 vote really counts.
Yes, indeed.
If it had been the biggest countries with the biggest,
they wouldn't get a look in, would they? I guess so. No. Indeed. I mean, and I guess the emphasis seems to be certainly in the modern Labour Party now under Sir Keir Starmer and prior to Jeremy under Miliband and to a much greater extent Blair and Brown, the emphasis seemed to be more about NATO, didn't it? I mean, and I wonder why on earth have we still? Why have we got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? Why is it even in existence still?
That's another argument altogether. I mean, I personally, and this is my own view, after the end of the Warsaw Pact, I couldn't really quite understand why NATO was still continuing. And of course, NATO, which, as you know, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is set up essentially North America and Europe, was not ever supposed to be a proactive military organization that got involved out of area. But that seems to have been happening in recent years. It appears to have become part of a kind of military-industrial complex of its own, frankly.
Indeed.
The idea when I was going, for what it's worth, my dad was in the British Army, and we was as a youngster we moved from all sorts of military bases, and I remember as in West Germany and latterly in Belgium. At the height of the Cold War, the NATO was concerned that the Soviet tanks were going to roll across the German plains. The idea, frankly, now that Russian Federation is going to roll tanks, from I don't know, Belarus into it is quite absurd. So the whole security situation has completely changed, and I think we've got to. I think what has really got to be revived is international agreements on chemical weapons, on nuclear weapons, on biological weapons, on weapons of mass destruction. There's got to be much greater, and cyber wars. Instead of constantly ramping these things up as different governments do, we need to be controlling them. Because the next war, as we know, is not going to be one of tanks and armies. It's going to be attacks on civilians, I guess.
Well, precisely. But I mean, some of these, the conventional weapons are appalling. I mean, they're all appalling. They're all horrible. They all inflict terrible, injury, maim, and kill people. I remember going to the air show when I was because in Derby we have Rolls-Royce in the city, and so we got an invite to go around there, and I was having a bit of a tour around, and I mean, there were a number of the stores sort of very proudly showing off the latest new missiles that they developed, and more and more sophisticated ways of killing people with conventional weapons, let alone I was staggered actually when I went to the UN when I was in New York, and we met up, didn't we, briefly one evening. Just looking at and you probably might know the statistic off the top of your head, but the colossal scale of expenditure on armaments around the world is just, I mean, it blew my mind. I hadn't appreciated it was quite as high as it was. I can't remember if you know what the statistic is off the top.
I wish I did. You should have asked me this before, and I would have mugged back on it, Chris.
It was a huge sum, though, and I think they were juxtaposing, though, it's something well over £1 trillion or something. But they were juxtaposing that with what it would cost to actually eliminate poverty around the world, eliminate extreme poverty. It was
these things are so very, very basic, and of course, the poverty and the division and the exploiting of these is what leads to wars. What is useful? I mean, the Syrian civil war, and which we talked about earlier, and which was kind of all sorts of other countries got involved. Many experts believe that it was kind of rooted originally in the issues around climate, around food shortages as a result of climate change, of water supply shortages. All of these things encourage conflict. And, the suffering that's going to result of this pandemic, the great movements of people, increasing desertification, all of these things lead to conflict. And you're right. I mean, just a percentage of the money frittered away on grotesque weaponry. Couldn't it make a great difference? Absolutely.
No, it really could. I mean, and that's another reason why I think we should be promoting the fantastic work that the UN does, in my opinion. Let's just move on quickly, because I want to give time for our viewers to have their say when we go to Sean in a moment. Just want to get your thoughts about Jeremy's latest initiative, the Peace and Justice Project. What's your thoughts on the prospects for that in terms of advancing the cause of peace and justice, and indeed socialism in the country?
I think it's going. I think it's got every chance of being successful if it becomes a real vehicle for change, a movement, if you like, and one that really brings in a really broad group of people, and one that's going to be democratic as well. I mean, this is really important. If it ends up being the small groups of people shouting at each other, it becomes fairly pointless. So I think so much depends on all of that. I think it's probably very important in many respects, because there are a lot of people who are now probably feeling quite homeless in terms of the politics, and who stands up for what they really believe in. I think people feel a bit battered, frankly, and the way that the Labour Party is heading isn't really for a lot of the youngsters that joined up. So, yeah, I think it's
older ones as well, actually, Mark.
Pardon?
All the older ones as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, one thing. What struck me, because I was in the States at the time, and we had a New York Labour Party branch, and when Ed Miliband stood down, there was a leadership and Jeremy emerged. I said to the chair, I said, look, we need to support Jeremy Corbyn. I said, look, he's not New Labour. All of these other people, they all voted for the welfare, the sort of trooped in for the welfare cuts and all the rest of it. They all were New Labour retreads. And for God's sake, Jeremy Corbyn, last one standing. Okay, he doesn't want to be leader, but he's standing, so he's going to have to be. And what was a revelation to me, like you, I've known him for years. I never saw him as being leader of the Labour Party, but actually there was a logic to it in the end, because he was one of the few who was opposed to the Iraq War. And this is what really powered so much of it. And the New Labour years, there was such a turn-off, and there were hardly any members left. So he brought all of that back. What I didn't appreciate when I was in the States is just the level of hostility, of sheer hysteria towards him that developed, and no sooner had he been elected than people were trying to get rid of him.
Yes.
And so the whole thing was utterly absurd. And I used to say to people, look, you say that he's this great. I mean, as far as the British media were concerned, the liberal media, he posed more of an existential threat to Britain than Boris Johnson. Let's be honest about it. That's what they thought. And I used to say to them, I used to say to these people, you go on about Jeremy Corbyn, his manifesto, you could compare it to what the SDP were putting up in 1983. It's mild. I'll tell you one thing I used to say is, if I was to take him around the United Nations, there'd be country after country, their permanent representative coming up to him and saying, good for you, Jeremy. Great to see you here. Thank you for all that you've done. I'm serious about that. And they wouldn't have known. If Boris Johnson comes along, makes a speech at the General Assembly, they think he's a clown. They wouldn't know who Keir Starmer is, or who Ed Miliband is, although Ed Miliband wanted a job at the United Nations, when he stopped being leader. They wouldn't know who all these people are. But Jeremy Corbyn, because of his international record, from apartheid to Palestine to the Chagos Islands, we were talking about that. I mean, wherever, he's been a great voice for the Global South. They like him. They like him.
No, indeed, absolutely. Well, I'm hopeful. I mean, and one of the things that we set up this resist movement, and we're keen to obviously work with Jeremy's new project. And what we've said all along from the very early start of our movement earlier this year is that, and we've not made the progress we'd wished for because of the COVID crisis, but we have got regional organisers all over the country. We've got thousands of members. And we want to get active in local communities. But the thing that we've been very clear about is that, we have to be an internationalist movement, as I've already said, but also we need to be, as it were, open to bringing people in and working with other groups and other movements, and not be precious about our movement and saying, well, it's our way or the highway. I think we absolutely have to collaborate. Those of us, who believe in a kind of a more just world, those of us who believe in a socialist alternative, I think it's incumbent upon us really to find common ground with each other instead of falling out with each other, which seems to have afflicted the left forever. I always talk about the Life of Brian syndrome that we seem to suffer from on the left. We've got to get through that. It's even more important now that we do that, because it seems to me the Labour Party is finished as a vehicle or a potential vehicle for socialism. I don't think that's ever going to come back. And I therefore feel that we do need to build a movement, and it will be a range of different strands, I think, in my view. And we need to learn the lesson. You talk about the Global South. We need to learn the lesson of places like Latin America, like Bolivia. The fact that they'd got a social movement underpinning the kind of electoral strategy they had there for the socialists under Evo Morales, when he was kicked out with the CIA-backed coup. Within a year, as you know, Mark, they were able to force the right-wing regime to hold new elections, and they came back with an even bigger thumping majority for the socialists than Evo Morales got. That was because the labour movement, the organised working class there, the trade unions and civil society, got together, and they brought the country to a standstill, essentially, and demanded change. And
what struck me, and you see, there's no even the machine politicians, these ghastly new Labour people in the PLP. You'll be familiar with most of them.
Oh my God, tell me about it.
A horrible time with them, probably. And I'm sure Jeremy Corbyn would be relieved that he can spend time with this new organisation rather than have to be harangued by foam-flecked bloody Labour MPs. But it strikes me that the agenda around social justice, socialism, equality, the environment, climate, all of these things really mattered to lots of people, and they do want. It hasn't gone away. Just because we've got this running that, and so this running that, it's all there. And as you were saying, you can't hold these social forces back. And who knows, frankly, what happens at the end of this pandemic? Who knows? Because the inequality has deepened. Unemployment is going to grow substantially. There is a great deal of suffering, more suffering in this country now. And we do know that the effects of COVID-19 have been worst felt amongst the BAME community, for instance, amongst poorer people, amongst people who are forced to go into work, who live in crowded housing, all of that. And people really will want change. And these political parties are going to look increasingly irrelevant.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just like my mum and dad's generation, I guess your mum and dad's generation too. You're a bit younger than me, Mark, but I suspect your mum and dad experienced the Second World War, and they were not prepared to go back to the indignities of the means test of the 1930s and poor quality housing, fearful about falling ill for not being able to pay their medical fees, and demanded something better. And I think, Labour had to respond to that, actually. And, it's unfortunate that, they sort of lost their way a little bit, that government, and got involved in the Korean War and the rest of it, and started imposing charges for prescription fees and one thing and another. Ended up, even though they got the biggest vote ever recorded when they lost the election, but with the vagaries of first past the post, of course, Churchill, as we know, came back in 1951. Look, it's 10-2 now. We've got about 10 minutes left, Mark. I just want to go to Sean now, if I can, and just sort of get reaction from viewers and let them put any comments or questions that they might have to you, Mark.
Sure.
Good evening. What a fascinating discussion we've had again tonight. Lots of questions coming in. Can I just ask people if they can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also subscribe to our Facebook page as well at Resistance Movement. Okay, so let's go through some of the comments and the questions we've had tonight. Maggie Wolf says Johnson & Co.'s policy of labelling their decisions as NHS decisions is having an impact, seeing online commentary blaming the NHS for pretty much everything up to and including deaths. Some very angry and frightened people out there had no success in countering this. Suggestions welcome. Atcha John says maybe COVID lockdowns, the effort in parts of Asia and certainly Australia has been, say, heavy-handed. Is this predictive of other state attitudes to come, maybe? Faraz Khan, do individual oligarch families who own global corporations manipulate the UN? A bit of conspiracy coming in there, I think. Scott Owen Marriott, Tony Blair was a Middle East peace envoy. I think that tells you everything you need to know about the UN. Faraz Khan, did the UN...
If I may, Sean, on that,
Yeah.
Tony Blair was not appointed by the United Nations as a Middle East peace envoy. There was something called a quartet, which are individual member states, and they made that appointment. Not all of them were happy with it. He was not a United Nations appointment, so that person needs to get their facts right.
Thank you for clearing that up for us. Faraz Khan asks, did the UN appoint Saudi as a human rights monitor?
Well, there is the Human Rights Committee, which is the membership is decided by the member states of the United Nations. And it is a real problem if some of those member states don't take human rights seriously. And clearly, Saudi Arabia is one of them.
Jack T asks, does the US have too much control over the UN?
It's probably still the biggest budget contributor, and despite the Trump cuts, historically the United States, and continuing on to Trump, to be fair to him, has been very supportive of the World Food Programme and various other key UN agencies. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we did talk briefly about the Security Council, and the United States is a permanent member, as is Britain, as is France, Russia, China, and so that they're the permanent five. And so yes, it has a huge amount of power. And of course, the UN is based in New York, and no Secretary General really wants to fall out with the United States, or indeed Russia or China, or he, and it has been a he so far, won't get a second term.
I'm going to take these next two questions because they are very similar. Danny Shell says, why is the UN such a toothless tiger with regard to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians? And Jack T says, when the UN declared Zionism to be racist, the USA lent on them to change their decision. Do you think there will ever be an opportunity to reverse that decision? And what is the point of the UN if they have no power to actually do anything about the Israeli occupation?
Well, I mean, the UN has repeatedly condemned the illegal settlements. It's repeatedly calls for a two-state solution. Now, of course, many on both sides of the argument don't really believe that's possible now. And certainly, where I'm coming from, I think that a one-state secular democratic solution is the one that the international community should be really pushing for. But you can have very direct UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Israel for its occupation, calling for it to withdraw from the occupied territories. But frankly, if the main member state...
Oh, we've lost you, Mark. You've frozen, Mark. I think have we lost Mark? That's a shame.
That was the big question of the night, that, Chris.
It was, wasn't it? What a shame. I don't know if we can get Mark back.
He was just in full flow there.
It was. Well, carry on with some. Oh, hang on.
Okay, well, is he
Carry on.
back?
Sorry about you lost me. Apologies for
Completely
that.
lost you.
I reckon it was the CIA or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Look, I mean, the problem is if member states refuse to follow up what with the UN General Assembly resolutions, then the UN is in a difficult state. I mean, don't forget when the world decided that it was going to support UN resolutions over apartheid South Africa, and finally the adopted economic sanctions, it had a major effect. And I think that obviously economic and military sanctions are probably the only means to force Israeli governments to actually acknowledge that they must accept international law over the occupied territories.
But do they have actual power to...
Well,
sorry, Chris, go on.
No, I was just going to say that will require, won't it, member states, though, to buy into it. I mean, and the problem is that, like in this country, the Israel lobby is very, very powerful, as it is in the United States with AIPAC, Bitcom in this country. So irrespective of what the UN says, unless member states like Britain, buy into that.
I think you're going to. What's got to happen is there's got to be. I mean, the Palestinians' main bugbear at the moment, frankly, is the fact that various Gulf sheikdoms are doing deals with Israel directly. These are called peace deals. They're not peace deals because the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, for instance, have never been at war, have any conflict with Israel. But what it does is it really does undercut the Palestinian cause. So when your closest and dearest are prepared to do that to you, and the Arab League is fairly useless, and Egypt is fairly useless, and all the rest of it, it's to expect the rest of the world to step up the plate is makes it even more problematic.
Yeah.
But frankly, I see the issue of the occupation, the longest occupation in history, the policies of apartheid that are being used in the occupied territories and in Israel itself against Palestinians. All of these things, the more people learn about this and know what's happening, also for young Israelis, they don't like if they actually. What was struck me when I spoke to Gideon Levy, an Israeli journalist who works for Haaretz newspaper, a great guy, said, "Look, I go to the occupied territories. The young Israelis don't. They don't see what's going on. Young Israelis. There have been different times in Israel's history when there's been a really powerful peace movement and a real powerful movement for." A proper a two-state solution, which actually gave real power to an independent Palestine, or for a one-state solution, as we've just been talking about. But that campaign has got to happen amongst people and in the global South and across the developing world and in Israel and Palestine, and that can empower the United Nations. The United Nations has got all of these resolutions, but when it comes to implementing them. That's a different matter because they're blocked very often. But don't.
I used to work in Cyprus many years ago, and obviously you probably know they have a UN peacekeeping force there permanently due to the war in 1974, and I used to do part of my job as a holiday rep at the time was to guide the cruises from Cyprus over to Egypt and Israel, and I always wondered why the UN hadn't put peacekeeping force into Israel.
Well, Israel won't let it. But don't forget, on the Golan Heights, for instance, where I've been, the buffer zone between the occupied territories of the Golan, which the United States has just kind of recognized as being now belonging to Israel, when it actually belongs to Syria. This is the Golan. The UN peacekeepers are there at the Golan Heights and have been since 1967, keeping both sides kind of apart. And what you're talking about in Cyprus, I mean, like you, I lived there as well, and I remember, UNICEF and the blue helmets, essentially, patrolling a border that shouldn't be there, but it's a border that until there's a final settlement between Turkey and Greece, is going to remain there. The problem in Israel-Palestine is the Israelis would not allow a UN force to go there. I mean, if law and order was to completely break down, if there was a civil war and insurrection, the Israeli government was no longer capable of controlling the occupied territories, well, maybe the situation would be different. But we are looking. It receives well over $3 billion each year in military aid from the United States. It is a nuclear state. It has nuclear weapons. It hasn't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's an enormously powerful, small military state. And so it's very difficult.
Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thanks very much indeed. We're just about out of time. In fact, we are out of time, Mark. That's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much indeed for taking the time out, and I'm sure there are many more questions that we weren't able to get to, but I really appreciate that. Let me wish you a very happy Christmas and a peaceful New Year, comrade, as well, going forward.
Thank you, Chris, and to you and to Sean, and thank you very much for having me, and it's been great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, and we'll perhaps get you back again another time if that's okay, Mark, because that was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. That's the end of the show tonight. Next week, on Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we've got Shadia Edwards-Dashti. She's a investigative journalist. She's been looking at the treatment of asylum seekers, again, in relation to the risk that they're being put to in the Napier Barracks, I think it is, in Kent, where they're being housed in very unacceptable circumstances, and the risk from COVID that they're experiencing, and other problems that they are encountering. So we've got her on talking about some of the work that she's been doing, exposing some of this stuff. So if you have a spare hour next Wednesday at 7 o'clock, please join us then. And in the meantime, thank you for watching and good night.